October 1887. By the second hour before dawn, Willow Bend had already lost the argument. The howling never stopped. It rolled down the valley in waves, layered upon itself, a sound so vast that men who had lived on the frontier their entire lives could not agree on where it came from. Some said the western ridge. Some said the river bottom. Others swore it came from every direction at once. In the pastures east of town, cattle were running blind through the darkness, colliding with fences, breaking legs on hidden stones, disappearing into the tree line where no lantern could follow. By sunrise, the tally would climb past 40. By noon, past 47. An entire prized herd, gone in a single night. And yet, on a small ridge above the wreckage, a woman in a wool coat stood without surprise. She had been waiting for this night for almost a year. Half a mile from where the last steer fell, Naomi Locke closed a leather notebook against her chest and watched the sky begin to gray. Beside her, an old blue heeler named Juno sat perfectly still, ears forward, tail motionless. The dog had not barked once. She had not moved when the first scream cut through the dark. She had simply listened, the way she always did, as if the mountain had already told her what was about to happen. Behind them, the small cedar cabin Naomi had built with her own hands stood untouched, its lantern still burning in the window. She had not slept. She had known better than to try. But the deeper question, the one nobody in Willow Bend had cared to ask, still hung in the cold air above the pasture. Why had she trusted the land when everyone else had trusted the ledgers? 14 months earlier, Willow Bend looked nothing like the ruined pasture the wolves would eventually claim. The valley was prospering. New fences cut clean lines across grassland that had, only a generation before, belonged to elk and bison, and the wolves that followed them. Cattle prices were high. The railroad was rumored to be approaching within 20 miles. Behind the polished counter of the town's small land office, Mayor Halloway spread a survey across the desk while 3 ranchers leaned in around him. The map showed the valley in its ideal form, every parcel accounted for, every waterway marked, every risk quietly erased. Naomi Locke stood at the back of the room in a plain gray dress, holding a folded paper of her own. She was not there to bid on land. She had come to warn them. The paper contained her sightings. 9 of them, dated across 6 months, tracks along Beaver Creek, deer carcasses stripped in a manner no cougar produced. Ravens gathering in numbers she had not seen in years. A single dawn observation of a large grayish shape moving along the northern ridge, moving the way only one animal moved. She had drawn each print at true size, measured with a tailor's rule. She had described gait, spacing, direction of travel. She had written, in careful ink, the same conclusion at the bottom of every entry. The wolves are returning. When she laid the paper on the mayor's desk, the room went silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then someone laughed. The laughter did not come from cruelty. It came from certainty. Everyone in that room had been told from the day the first rancher drove cattle into the valley that the wolves were finished. The bounties had done their work. The poison stations along the old trails had done the rest. Wolves belonged to the stories fathers told their sons about the years before the fences. They did not belong to now. They did not belong to a valley worth $80,000 in live beef. Mayor Halloway folded the paper in half without reading past the first line and slid it back across the desk. He was polite, the way men are polite when they wish to end a conversation. "Miss Locke," he said, "we appreciate your interest, but wolves have not been seen here in 12 years. Naomi took the paper back without argument. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked once at the map, once at the men around it, and once at the window where the ridge was visible in the distance. Then she said only a single sentence before she left. "I did not ask whether they had been seen. I said they were coming back." Long before Naomi Locke ever set foot in Willow Bend, she had learned to read a landscape the way most people learn to read a book. Her father had been a territorial naturalist, one of the last of a vanishing profession, hired by railroads and mining companies to catalog the wildlife along proposed routes before construction began. He had carried her, from the time she was 7 years old, into country most grown men avoided. She had slept in canvas tents beneath ridges where mountain lions passed within 20 feet of the fire. She had learned to identify 17 bird calls before she could reliably spell her own last name. She had watched her father kneel beside prints in wet clay and explain, in the same calm voice he used for everything, exactly what had walked there, how heavy it had been, and how many hours ago it had gone. Wolves had been the subject he returned to most often. Not because he loved them, though he did, but because they were the animal that revealed the most about the health of a valley. Where the wolves went, everything else made sense. Where the wolves vanished, the deer overpopulated, the coyotes multiplied, the elk pushed into places they had never grazed before, and slowly, over years, the whole system began to tilt. Her father called them the quiet accountants of the wilderness. They kept the books nobody else could read. When she was 15, she watched him drop dead of a heart attack beside a creek in the Bitterroots, his notebook still open on the bank. She carried that notebook out on her own. She had been carrying one ever since. Willow Bend had drawn her by chance. A distant aunt had left her a small stipend and a claim on 80 acres of high pasture along the eastern rim of the valley. Most women in her position would have sold the parcel and moved to Helena or Bozeman. Naomi arrived with 3 trunks, a rifle, a dog, and a set of surveyor's instruments that had belonged to her father. She built the cabin herself over the course of a single summer, hiring only one man for the roof and paying him in silver dollars she had earned copying maps for a mining office in Butte. By the time the first frost came, she had a house, a woodshed, a small root cellar dug into the hillside, and a routine. Every morning before dawn, she walked a 4-mile loop through her acreage and the public land beyond it, notebook in one hand, rifle over her shoulder, Juno padding silently at her heel. She was not looking for wolves in those early months. She was simply doing what her father had taught her. Watch, measure, record. The valley began speaking to her almost immediately. She noticed that the mule deer along the creek had grown fat and lazy, standing in the open at midday, no longer bothering to test the wind. She noticed that coyote populations had exploded, their tracks crisscrossing every muddy bank. She noticed that certain elk trails, marked on her father's old regional maps from 20 years earlier, still bore faint use, as if some deep memory in the herds refused to let those roots die. All of these were signs of a valley with no upper predator, a valley that had been running on borrowed time for more than a decade. And then, in April, she found the first print. It was pressed into the soft mud beside a small tributary that fed Beaver Creek, and she knew what it was before her knee had touched the ground. She measured it 3 times to be certain. 4¾ inches long, 4⅛ inches wide. 4 toes forward, 1 pad behind, claw marks visible at the tips. No dog in the valley made a print of that size and shape. No coyote came close. She sat back on her heels and looked at the ridge line above the creek for a long time. Then she opened her notebook and drew the print exactly, with the date and the weather and the direction of travel. She did not tell anyone, not yet. One print was a rumor. She wanted a story. Over the next 6 months, the story built itself. A second print, then a third, then a scatter of them along a game trail nobody used. A deer carcass with the ribs pulled apart in a pattern only wolves produced. A morning in September when she watched, through her father's brass field glasses, a large gray shape move along the northern ridge at a distance of perhaps 400 yards. It moved with the unmistakable trot of a wolf. She lowered the glasses and understood exactly what was coming. The morning after the mayor folded her paper in half, Naomi walked into Willow Bend proper for the first time in weeks. She needed flour, coffee, and a new box of cartridges for the Winchester she kept above the cabin door. She also needed, though she would not have admitted it aloud, to measure the temperature of the town. She wanted to know how the story of her warning had traveled overnight, and what shape it had taken by the time it reached the general store. She did not have to wait long to find out. The moment she stepped through the door of Halstead's Mercantile, 3 men at the counter fell silent in a way that told her everything. Corbin Halstead himself broke the silence with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Locke," he said, "we were just talking about you." Behind him, A rancher named Ul Rourke leaned against a barrel of pickled pork and studied her with open amusement. Rourke ran the largest herd in the valley, nearly 300 head of prime Hereford stock grazing on leased grass east of the river. He had built that operation across 15 years of careful work, and he did not appreciate being told, by a woman half his age with no cattle of her own, that his investment was standing on the edge of something dangerous. He tipped his hat to her the way a man tips his hat to a joke. "Heard you saw a wolf," he said. Naomi set her list on the counter and answered without looking at him. "I have seen 9 sets of tracks, 1 carcass, and 1 animal at 400 yards. I saw a wolf on the 4th of September at 17 minutes past sunrise." Rourke laughed. "That's a lot of arithmetic for a shadow." She did not argue. She had learned, from watching her father argue with railroad engineers and mining company clerks for the better part of a decade, that arithmetic did not persuade men who had already decided what they believed. What persuaded them was the arrival of the thing they had been told could not arrive. She paid for her flour and her coffee and her cartridges, thanked Halstead with a small nod, and walked out into the pale October sun. Behind her, she could hear Rourke start a second round of laughter before the door had even closed. She kept walking. Juno fell in at her side without a sound, and together they crossed the dusty street toward the wagon she had left tied at the water trough. She had done what her father would have done. She had put the warning on the record. Whatever happened next, no one could say they had not been told. Not everyone in Willow Bend laughed. As she was untying the horse, a small figure detached itself from the shade of the post office and crossed the street toward her. Etta Byan was the town's schoolteacher, a widow of perhaps 40, thin as a fence rail and twice as straight. She had come west from Vermont 11 years earlier with a husband who had died of pneumonia within the first winter, and she had stayed on out of a stubbornness that Naomi recognized immediately as kin to her own. Etta did not smile easily, and she did not smile now. She simply stopped beside the wagon and lowered her voice. "I read your list," she said. "Halloway left it on his desk. I read it before he threw it out." Naomi paused with her hand on the harness buckle, and Etta glanced once at the mercantile door. "And I taught school in Wisconsin for 6 years before I came out here. I know what a wolf print looks like. You drew them right. It was a small thing. It should not have mattered." But Naomi felt something inside her ease by a fraction she had not realized was clenched. She thanked Etta with a single nod, the way people who have grown up in silence thank each other, and she climbed onto the wagon seat. Before she flicked the reins, Etta added one more sentence quietly, almost to herself. "They will not believe you until they lose something. And by then," she said, "it will be too late to make the loss small." Naomi did not answer. She did not need to. She had known that sentence since the day she had drawn the first print in her book. She turned the wagon toward the ridge and started the long, slow climb home. Behind her, Willow Bend was already forgetting the conversation. Above her, the ridges were not. Winter came early that year, and it came hard. The first heavy snow arrived in the second week of November, 3 weeks ahead of the almanac's prediction, and it did not melt off. It settled into the shadows along the north-facing slopes and stayed there, waiting for the rest of the season to catch up. For most of the ranchers in Willow Bend, the early snow was an inconvenience. It meant hauling feed sooner than expected. It meant checking fences in weather that stung the fingers through wool gloves. It meant, for Ul Rourke in particular, moving his prized breeding stock down from the high pasture to the lower fields along the river a full month before he had planned. For Naomi Locke, the early snow was something else entirely. It was a page turning in a book she had been reading for a year, and she could feel the story picking up speed beneath her hands. Snow was the great revealer. In summer, a wolf could pass through a valley for weeks and leave nothing behind but a few prints in creek mud and the occasional stripped carcass in a thicket. In snow, a wolf left a signature that even a blind man could follow with a stick. Naomi began her morning walks earlier now, sometimes leaving the cabin before the sky had begun to gray, a lantern in one hand and Juno pressed close to her leg. She was not looking for evidence anymore. She had that. She was looking for the shape of what was coming, the way a doctor looks at a fever chart and tries to guess how bad the night will be. Within 10 days of the first snowfall, she had counted the tracks of at least 4 different animals. Within 3 weeks, she was certain there were 7. 7 was not a rumor. 7 was a pack. And a pack of that size, in a valley that had not held wolves for more than a decade, was not a group of drifters passing through on their way to somewhere else. It was a family that had arrived to stay. She sat one evening at her small table with the lantern turned low and drew the territory as she understood it, using her father's old regional map as a base. She marked the places where she had found scat, the places where she had found kills, the places where the trails converged and the places where they scattered. When she was done, she leaned back and looked at what she had drawn. The center of the pack's range was the northern ridge, 6 miles above town. The southern edge of that range came down almost exactly to the least grass where Ul Rourke had just moved 300 head of Hereford cattle. She wrote a second letter that night. This one was addressed to Rourke directly. She did not mention her earlier warning. She did not remind him of the laughter at the mercantile counter. She simply described in the same careful ink she used for everything what she had found. 7 animals, established range, southern boundary within 2 miles of his winter pasture. She recommended in one short paragraph at the end that he move his herd back across the river to the higher ground west of the road, where the terrain was more broken and a running herd could not be pushed as easily. She sealed the letter, walked it down to the post office the next morning, and paid the 2-cent stamp herself. She never received a reply. Later, she would learn that Rourke had read the letter at his kitchen table, laughed once, and used it to light his pipe. December passed. The valley grew quieter in the way that only deep winter valleys grow quiet, the sound of the river narrowing beneath its ice, the smoke from the town's chimneys rising straight up in the still cold air. Naomi kept walking her loop. She kept measuring. She kept writing. She noticed in the last week of December that the pack had begun to shift its pattern. The old trails along the northern ridge showed less use. New trails appeared closer to the river, closer to the fences, closer to the smell of 300 fat Herefords bedded down in a single unguarded field. She stood one morning in a stand of aspens above Rourke's pasture and watched the cattle graze through the thin snow, oblivious, comfortable, and impossibly slow. She did not need her father's voice in her head to tell her what she was seeing. She was seeing a pantry with the door left open. She tried one more time. That was the part of the story she would carry with her, quietly, for the rest of her life. She could have stayed on her ridge and let the valley learn its lesson without her. She could have decided, with some justification, that she had already done more than was owed to a town that had laughed her out of its land office. But her father had taught her that a warning delivered once was a courtesy, and a warning delivered twice was a duty, and she had never been able to unlearn the lesson. So, on the 2nd day of January, in weather cold enough to freeze the ink in her pen, if she did not keep the bottle inside her coat, she hitched the wagon and drove down into Willow Bend for the 2nd time in a season. She went first to the church, because the church was where the town met on Sunday afternoons to discuss matters that were larger than any single household. Pastor Ridley was a soft-spoken man from Ohio who did not know her well but who had never given her cause for offense, and he agreed, after some hesitation, to let her speak briefly at the end of the afternoon gathering. She did not prepare a speech. She simply carried her notebook and a rolled map, and when Ridley called her name, she walked to the front of the pews and stood beside the small iron stove and told the assembled ranchers, merchants, and wives what she had found. She spoke for less than 4 minutes. She showed the map. She named the number 7. She recommended plainly that any herd within 2 miles of the northern ridge be moved or watched with armed riders until the pack had been formally hunted or driven out. Then she rolled the map back up and sat down. The silence that followed was different from the silence at the mercantile. It was not amused. It was uncomfortable. Nobody laughed this time because the room was too full of women and children for laughter to feel safe, but nobody stood to agree with her either. Mayor Halloway rose instead. He did not attack her. He did not need to. He simply thanked her for her concern, reminded the room that the Territorial Bounty Office in Helena kept careful records of wolf activity across the entire western half of Montana, and noted, with a small apologetic smile, that no such activity had been reported in the Willow Bend Valley for 11 consecutive years. He was certain, he said, that Miss Locke had seen something. What she had seen, he suggested gently, was more likely a large coyote, a stray dog, or perhaps a lone wolf passing through on its way to better country. 7 animals, he said, was a great many wolves. It was, he said, more wolves than the entire eastern half of the territory was thought to hold. She did not argue with him. She had not come to argue. She had come to make a record, and the record was now made. She left the church with Juno at her heel and drove home in a snow that had begun to fall in fine dry flakes, the kind of snow that meant the temperature was dropping and the storm behind it was serious. UL Rourke passed her wagon on the road outside town, riding a big bay gelding in the opposite direction. He tipped his hat. He was smiling. She did not smile back. That night, alone at her table with the lantern turned high against the early dark, she made 2 decisions. The first was that she would not go into town again until spring. She had done what could be done. She would not spend her breath a third time. The second decision was harder, and she wrote it down in her notebook so that she could not later pretend she had not made it. She would keep watching. She would keep recording. But she would also begin to prepare her own small holding for what she believed was coming. She had no cattle to lose, but she had a milk cow, 6 laying hens, and Juno, and she had herself. She spent the next 3 evenings reinforcing the henhouse with heavier boards. She moved the cow into the shed attached to the cabin itself. She cleaned the Winchester, oiled the action, and laid out 40 rounds of ammunition on the shelf above the door. Then she sat down to wait. The valley did not have to wait long. The storm that came in on the 18th of January was not, by the standards of a Montana winter, an unusual storm. It was cold, but not remarkably so. It brought perhaps 8 inches of new snow across 2 days, less than the valley had seen in several previous weeks. What made the storm matter was not its size. What made it matter was its timing, and the way it collapsed the last thin barriers between a hungry pack and a pantry that had been left open for a month. Wolves hunt best in fresh snow, when scent lies heavy on the ground and the crust has not yet formed to betray their approach. Wolves hunt best on nights when the moon is full and the sky is clear behind the storm, because they see in that light better than any prey they follow. The night of the 20th of January, 1888, gave them both conditions in a single sky. Naomi went to bed that evening with the Winchester across the foot of the bed and Juno curled on the floor beside her. She did not expect the wolves to come to her cabin. She had planned her holding carefully. The henhouse was tight. The cow was inside walls no wolf could push through in a single night, and her small parcel sat high enough on the ridge that no herd of prey animals had ever moved across it. The wolves would go where the food was easiest, and the food was not on her ridge. The food was 2 miles below her, spread across an unguarded pasture, 300 head of slow, fat cattle bedded down in the open beneath a bright moon. She lay awake for a long time listening to the wind die away as the storm passed. Sometime after midnight, she heard the first howl. It came from the north, a single long note that rose and fell and hung in the cold air for what felt like a full minute before it faded. She sat up in bed and reached for her coat. A second howl answered from the west, closer, higher pitched, the voice of a younger animal. Then a third from the same direction as the first, and a fourth that came from somewhere she could not immediately place, somewhere lower on the slope, somewhere much closer to the river. Juno was already on her feet, ears forward, body absolutely still. She was not growling. She was listening the way she had listened for months, the way she had listened on every morning walk when Naomi had knelt beside a print in the mud. She was listening the way a dog listens when a thing she has been waiting for has finally arrived. Naomi did not light the lantern. She dressed in the dark, buttoned her coat to the throat, pulled her father's old sheepskin gloves over her hands, and took the Winchester down from the wall. She did not intend to go anywhere. She simply intended not to be caught unready. She sat at the small table by the window with the rifle across her lap and the dog at her feet, and she listened. And as she listened, she began to count. Not the howls themselves, because howls carried and echoed and doubled back on the ridges in ways that could deceive even an experienced ear. She counted the pauses between them. She counted the intervals. She counted the way a naturalist counts, the way her father had taught her, letting the numbers build a picture in her head of animals she could not see. By 1:30 in the morning she had a picture. There were at least 7 animals working the slope below her. They were moving in coordination. They were moving toward the river. At 16 minutes before 2, the howling stopped. That was the moment she understood the hunt had begun. Wolves fell silent when they closed the distance. The silence itself was the loudest thing she had heard all night. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked down toward the valley. The moon was still bright behind the last thin shreds of cloud, and the snow reflected its light back into the sky until the whole valley glowed a pale, ghostly blue. She could see the black line of the river. She could see the darker patch of Rourke's pasture beyond it. She could not see the cattle. She did not need to. She could hear them. The first scream came at 2 minutes before 2. The sound that came up out of the valley in the small hours of that morning was not one thing. It was many things layered upon each other in a way that made it impossible for anyone who heard it to describe accurately afterward. There was the bawling of cattle in panic, a sound that begins low in the chest and climbs into a high broken cry that no rancher ever forgets once he has heard it. There was the crash of animals 1,000 pounds apiece running blind into fences and each other, the splintering of rails, the deep flat thud of a body going down onto frozen ground. There was the crack of ice giving way where the smaller creek fed into the river, and the terrible thrashing of a heifer that had gone through it. And beneath all of it, threading through it like a stitch that held the whole terrible fabric together, there was the sound the wolves had stopped making an hour before. They were working in silence now. The silence was the worst part. Naomi did not go down. She had thought about it in the long minutes between the last howl and the first scream, and she had made the decision the way her father had taught her to make decisions in country where a mistake could not be walked back. She was one woman with a rifle. She could not stop 7 wolves from taking what they had come for. She could only add one more body to the pasture if she tried. She stayed at the window with Juno pressed against her leg, and she watched the moonlit valley, and she listened to Willow Bend learn, in a single hour, what she had been trying to tell it for 14 months. She did not weep. She did not pray. She simply witnessed, because witnessing was the last respect she could pay to animals that were dying for a warning nobody had wanted to hear. Down in the valley, the town was waking. She could see lantern light appearing in the windows of the houses along the main road, one after another, like matches struck in a row. She could see riders beginning to gather at the livery, small dark shapes against the pale snow. She could see, farther out, the flicker of a torch moving along the fence line of Rourke's pasture, and she knew without being told that it was Rourke himself, riding alone toward a disaster he had lit his pipe with a warning about. She watched the torch stop. She watched it stand still for a long time. Then she watched it turn back toward town, moving slower than it had gone out, and she understood that Ul Rourke had just seen the first of what would eventually be 47 bodies scattered across his winter pasture. The wolves were gone by first light. Naomi knew they would be. Wolves that had eaten did not linger in the open, and wolves that had killed on that scale had eaten what they could, and cached what they could not, and vanished back into the country above the ridge before the sun cleared the eastern hills. She waited until the sky had turned properly gray, until the color of the snow had shifted from moon blue to the flat white of a January dawn, and then she took the Winchester and the notebook and she walked down. Juno came with her. Juno had not left her side since the first howl. The two of them descended the ridge through snow that came to Naomi's knees in the drifts, and they did not speak, because there was nothing to say, and because Juno had never needed words to know what her person was thinking. She reached the edge of Rourke's pasture at 17 minutes past 7. She knew the time exactly because she checked her father's watch out of the habit of a woman who had been trained to record everything. She stopped at the broken rail where the herd had first burst through the fence, and she stood there for a long moment before she stepped across. The snow beyond the rail was not white anymore. It had been white 6 hours before. Now it was the color of a butcher's floor, tracked and churned and streaked in long, dark drag marks that led away in every direction. She counted bodies as she walked. She did not want to. She could not help it. It was what her father had taught her to do, and grief had never yet been strong enough to unteach her. She counted 29 before she reached the middle of the pasture. She was not alone in the pasture for long. By the time she had counted past 30, riders were arriving from town in a slow, uneven column, some on horseback and some on foot, some carrying rifles they had not yet decided how to use, and some carrying nothing at all because shock had emptied their hands before they had left their own doorsteps. Ul Rourke sat on his big bay gelding at the far end of the pasture, motionless, his hat pushed back, and his gloved hands folded on the pommel of his saddle, staring at a stretch of red snow the way a man stares at a fire that has already burned his house to the ground. He did not look up when Naomi came within 30 feet of him. He did not look up when she stopped and stood quietly with the notebook closed at her side. He was not ignoring her. He simply could not, at that moment, meet the eyes of anyone who had told him the truth before he had been willing to hear it. Mayor Holloway arrived on foot, breathing hard, his coat unbuttoned despite the cold. He walked past 3 bodies without seeming to see them, stopped in the middle of the pasture, and turned in a slow full circle. And when he had completed the circle, he closed his eyes for a long moment and did not open them again for what felt like the better part of a minute. When he did open them, he saw Naomi standing near the broken fence, and something passed across his face that she would remember for a long time afterward. It was not shame, exactly. Shame was a private thing, and what she saw was more public than that. It was the look of a man who has just understood, in one clean stroke, that he will spend the rest of his career answering for a single afternoon in a land office. He walked toward her slowly. Halfway across the pasture, he stopped beside the body of a heifer and rested one hand briefly on her flank, as if to steady himself, and then he came the rest of the way. He stopped 6 feet in front of her and removed his hat. "Miss Locke," he said. His voice was not the voice he had used in the church. It was smaller and it was older, and it was honest in a way she had not heard from him before. "Miss Locke," he said again, "I would take it as a kindness if you would tell me, as best you can, what happened here last night." She told him. She did not dress it up and she did not soften it. She told him about the howls and the count and the pauses and the silence that had followed. She told him about the moon and the fresh snow, and the way 7 animals working together could push a herd of 300 through a fence in under 20 minutes if the herd had never learned to fear them. She told him, without pointing at anyone, that the animals she had been reporting for 14 months had done exactly what animals of that kind did when they were given the opportunity she had described in her letters and her map and her 4 minutes at the front of his church. When she was done, Holloway did not answer. He simply stood there with his hat in his hands and nodded once, slowly, and then he walked away toward the growing crowd at the fence to begin the terrible arithmetic of the day. Rourke did not come to her that morning. He was not ready. He would come later in his own time, and when he came it would matter more than any apology delivered in the first hour of a disaster. That morning he sat on his horse and counted his own dead, and by mid-afternoon the count had stopped at 47 confirmed carcasses in the pasture and along the river bottom, with another 9 missing head that would never be recovered. 56 animals, nearly 1 in 5 of his entire herd. At the market prices of that winter, the loss came to something between $14,000 and $16,000, a sum that would have bought a small ranch outright in most parts of the territory. It was, by any measure the town could apply to it, the largest single-night livestock loss in the recorded history of the Willow Bend Valley. And it had happened, every witness knew, exactly where and when Naomi Locke had said it would. The days that followed were strange in a way that Naomi had not expected. She had prepared herself, across 14 months of quiet warnings and quieter dismissals, for a certain kind of aftermath. She had imagined that the town would come to her, hats in hands, and that the reckoning would be immediate and public and probably uncomfortable for everyone involved. What actually happened was slower than that, and stranger, and in the end more meaningful. The town did not come to her all at once. It came to her one person at a time, across the length of a long winter, in a series of small, quiet visits that she began to recognize by their shape before the visitor had finished tying his horse to her rail. Etta Bayan came first, on the afternoon of the second day. She brought a covered basket with bread still warm from her own oven, and she did not stay long, and she did not say anything about being right or being wrong. She simply sat at Naomi's table for 20 minutes drinking coffee and looking out the window at the ridge, and before she left she reached across the table and placed her hand briefly over Naomi's own, and that was all. It was enough. Pastor Ridley came on the fourth day. He apologized without flourish for the way the church meeting had ended, and he asked, quietly, whether she would be willing to write down what she had told the mayor and the pastor so that the town could keep a proper record of it. She agreed. She had been keeping the record for a year. Another page cost her nothing. Elias Hart, the carpenter who had spent most of the previous winter building new fencing for Rourke's operation, arrived on the sixth day with two other men and a wagon full of milled cedar. He did not ask permission. He simply began, without ceremony, to reinforce the outer walls of her henhouse and to add a second heavier door to the shed where her cow was stabled. When she came out to tell him she had not asked for the work, he stopped what he was doing and looked at her for a long moment and said only, "I know you did not." Then he went back to his hammering. She stood in the doorway with her coat unbuttoned in the cold, and she watched him work, and she did not say anything else, because there was nothing to say that he had not already understood. Ul Rourke came on the 11th day. He came alone, on foot, which surprised her more than anything else about the visit, because Rourke was a man who did not walk anywhere he could ride. He arrived at her door in the late afternoon with his hat already in his hand, and his face drawn thin from 11 nights of poor sleep. She let him in without a word. She poured him coffee. She did not sit down across from him because she was not certain yet what shape the conversation was going to take, and she wanted to be able to move if she needed to. He drank half the cup before he spoke. When he did speak, he did not offer excuses. He said plainly that he had burned her letter, and that he had laughed at her at the mercantile counter, and that he had told two other ranchers at the feed store in December that Naomi Locke was a spinster with an overactive imagination and a father who had filled her head with campfire stories. He said all of this looking at the table, not at her. And when he was done, he did finally raise his eyes and he said, "I was wrong about every part of it. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am telling you that I know." She let the silence hold for a moment before she answered. Then she said, quietly, that she did not require his forgiveness or his apology, but that she would accept both, because they had cost him something to bring, and because a man who could carry that cost across her threshold on foot was a man worth building a valley with. He nodded once and finished his coffee and stood to go. At the door he stopped and turned back and asked her, in a voice she had not heard him use before, whether she would be willing to walk his remaining pasture with him in the spring and tell him where he should and should not put his herd. She said she would. Spring came late to the valley that year, as if the land itself needed extra time to recover from what had happened in January. The snow held on into the middle of April, and the first true thaw did not arrive until nearly the end of the month. When it did arrive, it came all at once, and Beaver Creek ran high and brown for 3 weeks, carrying with it the last physical traces of the night the wolves had come down. By the time the pasture grass began to show green again, the bodies had been long removed, the broken fences had been rebuilt to a heavier standard, and the valley had begun, quietly, to organize itself around a new set of assumptions. Naomi Locke walked Rourke's ground with him on the 9th of May, as she had promised, and she carried her father's notebook and her measuring rule and she showed him, across the length of a long, slow afternoon, where a herd could bed safely and where it could not. She was not alone in that work for long. Word traveled, as word does in a small valley, and by the middle of June she had walked the grazing land of 4 other ranchers at their own request, and by August the number had grown to 11. The Territorial Bounty Office in Helena, prompted by a strongly worded letter from Mayor Holloway and a signed statement from every rancher who had lost stock that winter, dispatched 2 professional hunters to the northern ridge in early June. The hunters worked for 6 weeks and took 4 of the 7 wolves. The remaining 3, Naomi believed, had moved north into wilder country before the hunters ever arrived, because wolves that had survived to breed a pack in a valley that had forgotten them were not wolves that waited around to be shot. She did not say this to the hunters. She let them collect their bounty, and she let the town believe the danger had been fully answered, because a town that believed a story had ended was a town that would remember at last to prepare for its next chapter. She lived in the cabin on the ridge for another 31 years. She never married, though she had at least 2 chances she considered seriously, and one she considered for the better part of a summer. She kept the notebook. She began a second one, and then a third, and eventually a shelf full of them, each one filled with the same patient, careful ink she had been trained to use since she was a child kneeling beside her father in the mud of a creek bank in the Bitterroots. Juno lived another 6 years and was buried on the small rise behind the cabin where the morning sun struck first. Naomi buried 3 dogs on that rise in the end. She always chose blue heelers. She always gave them names from her mother's family. She always trained them the same way, to listen before they barked and to trust the mountain before they trusted the person. UL Rourke rebuilt his herd across 4 years and eventually ran it at a size and profitability that exceeded what he had held before the loss. He credited Naomi publicly, more than once, in ways that embarrassed her and that she asked him privately to stop doing. He did not stop. He outlived her by 9 months and was buried in the Willow Bend Cemetery under a stone that named him, at his own instruction, as a rancher who had learned in time. Mayor Holloway did not run for a 3rd term. He said, when pressed, that he had come to understand there were forms of listening a man had to learn before he was fit to lead, and that he had not yet, in his own estimation, finished learning them. Etta Byen taught school for another 22 years and left, in her will, a small sum to be used for the purchase of natural history books for the schoolhouse library. The first book purchased under that bequest was a bound edition of the field notes of a territorial naturalist who had died beside a creek in the Bitterroots in 1867. The bronze marker at the base of the ridge, placed by the town in the year after Naomi's death, carries no dates and no titles. It carries one sentence, chosen by a committee that argued for 3 weeks before it agreed on the wording. She read the land before the land had to speak. That was enough. The valley, at last, had learned to listen. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who loves stories of quiet courage, and subscribe for more tales of the people history nearly forgot.